Good to see each and every one of you out this morning, and I encourage you to be taking out your Bibles and following along to test the things I have to say, to see that they be by God's Word. Hope that we'll find them to be the truth, we can take and apply them in our everyday walks of life. We can leave here being better servants of God in the future than we've been in the past. God in the future than we've been in the past. We began a few weeks ago a series of lessons on divorce and remarriage. And we have gone through already and talked sort of an introductory lesson to divorce, in which we talked about God in marriage. And God in terms of our relationship, how God instituted the marriage relationship. And so it's God's law and God's plans that we follow concerning the marriage relationship. His Word is the standard as to what constitutes scriptural marriage or a scriptural divorce. His Word governs how we conduct ourselves in that marriage relationship. Then we talked about some reasons we need to study this issue, because there are various positions on divorce and remarriage. And so we talked remarriage. And so we talked about the fact that here are all these different viewpoints. And so because of that, we need to know what the truth is and how to answer that error. We talked about some key terms in that lesson. We talked about what divorce is. It's to separate, to loose from intercourse. Therefore, pornography and things like that are not constitute a reason for divorce, because it's fornication. It's unlawful sexual intercourse. We talked about the bond and the definition of the bond, how we're bound by God's law, and we'll talk more about that here in just a moment in Romans chapter 7. Is Matthew 19 old or new law? Is there only one cause for divorce? Can we divorce for just any reason? We'll talk about some questions. We talked about some questions we were seeking to answer in our lessons, in our other lessons. Then last week we talked about Matthew 19 and the law concerning divorce. We talked about the question that Jesus was asked. The question was, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason or any cause? That's a significant question, because the answer Jesus gives is the answer to that question. The answer was emphatically no. He pointed out that he that made them at the beginning made emphatically no. He pointed out that he that made them at the beginning made them male and female. That is, one man for one woman. That is no. How they were to leave father and mother and cleave or be joined to one another. That was no. He pointed out how they are no longer. He pointed out how they are no longer two flesh but one. That was no. And then we saw how he pointed out that what God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. The answer was no. So they asked him a second question, and he gave them, did Moses command a certificate of divorce? And Jesus points out Moses commanded nothing. Deuteronomy 24 is what they have in mind, 1 through 4. And Moses commanded nothing, but they were permitted, or he suffered them because of the hardness of their hearts. But from the beginning it was not so. The plan from the beginning was do not divorce. He points out whoever divorces his wife commits adultery. Yes, there's an exception there. We talked about that exception last week. But the rule is do not divorce. And so we took that text and used it to answer some error that is commonly taught concerning divorce and remarriage last week. We have just two lessons now remaining today, and if you haven't already, turn to Romans chapter 7. We're going to talk about the marriage and the bond, because an understanding of Romans chapter 7 is vital in our understanding of who can and cannot marry. Is scriptural or not? If you understand Romans 7, the marriage and the bond, you can answer a lot of questions about marriage and divorce. Next week, we'll be answering some questions, common questions on divorce and marriage. And so I want to remind you that on the back table, back where we have the place where you put your contribution, there's a basket for marriage. Put that question on that sheet, fold it up, and put it in that basket. I'm going to pick those up tonight so I can get a head start on working on next week's lesson. And so if you'll submit those by tonight, before you leave tonight, when I leave at the end of services tonight, I'm taking a basket with me with the questions and working a basket working on those questions you have on divorce and remarriage. But it may be that you say, I had a question which you've already answered, or maybe we'll answer your question this morning. If you have any, fill that out and put it on in that basket in the back, and we'll deal with those questions next week. Now, Romans chapter 7, our lesson this morning on the marriage and the bond. Romans chapter 7. In the passage, we already saw the passage that was read for us earlier in Romans 7, 1 through 3. That is our key passage in discussing marriage and the bond. But before we get into discussing how this all applies, let's just look basically at what the text look at later on. We will look at later on the marriage and the bond more closely, but right now I want us to just get an idea of what the text itself is saying. Here's what the text is saying in Romans 7, 2 through 3. For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband, is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. You see here we've got them in different colors. Here's the first thing it tells us here in red. They're bound by law to her husband as long as he lives. That tells us of the permanence of marriage. She's bound to him as long as he lives. She's bound to him as long as he lives. God intends for the marriage to be permanent. He intends for marriage to last until the death of one of the two partners. Marriage is for life. Here's the second thing he points out. If the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband in verse 3. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she is married to another man. So here's the rule. The rule was marriage for life, verse 2. In the case where one of them dies, the other is free to remarry. So marriage is permanent, marriage is for life. When one's mate dies, they then have the right to remarry. But they cannot divorce and remarry. Yes, I know there's an exception, but the rule is no divorce and remarriage. The man shall be called an adulteress. And so, here's what we're seeing here in Romans chapter 7. Marriage is for life, verse 2. They're bound as long as they live. But if one's mate dies, they are free to remarry. But if they remarry while that mate lives, they are free to remarry. But if they remarry while that mate lives, they are guilty of adultery. They are called an adulteress, it says of her in this verse. Now this is important, because she's not called by man an adulteress. Yes, hopefully we understand in divorce that she is still bound to the first man. More about that later on. She's still bound to the first man, though, and she's guilty of adultery because she didn't have a right to be divorced and a right to be remarried. But she's not called an adulteress here in verse 3 by man. This term called means to be called an adulteress. This Greek word rendered called here is used time and time again in Scripture and is referring, to my knowledge, in every single case, to be in reference to something God had said. For example, Matthew chapter 2. Be turning with me there. Matthew chapter 2. If you remember in Matthew chapter 2, this is where, in Matthew chapter 2, after Jesus has been born and the wise men come to visit, after they've come to visit, Herod told them to go find this child that was born, and then come back and tell me where he is. Go find this child that was born, and then come back and tell me where he is, so I can go worship him. Herod had an ulterior motive. He wanted to kill the child. So these wise men, they were warned in verse 12. They were divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, and they departed for their own country another way. That they should not return to Herod. And they departed for their own country another way. They were divinely warned. That's our same word is called in Romans chapter 7. Skip down to verse 22 of the same text. Verse 22. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, afraid to go there, and being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region of Galilee. He was warned by God in this case. In Matthew 2:22. You know that word warned by God? Same word as called here in Romans chapter 7. Acts 10 as well. Cornelius the centurion, was a good reputation among the nations, was divinely instructed by a holy angel to summon you to his house and to hear words from you. So Cornelius was told by an angel to go get Peter and bring Peter, and Peter would teach him what they needed to do to be saved. But the message the angel brought, Peter would teach him what they needed to do to be saved. But the message the angel brought, even though the angel was speaking to him, was a message from God, and so he was divinely instructed in Acts chapter 10. Now we're divinely instructed. That's our same word is called here in Romans chapter 7. So here's what I'm saying here. Divinely warned about the flood and moved with godly fear. What I'm seeing here in Romans chapter 7 is when one is married to somebody they don't have a right to be married to, they're called an adulteress, and they're called that by God. Hopefully we recognize that. But whether man says it or not, because the world won't admit adultery is what it is. Then it'll be fine to divorce and marry again, divorce and marry again, divorce and marry again, and it's all okay in the eyes of the world. They won't call that adultery, but it doesn't matter because God did here in Romans chapter 7. God calls her an adulteress. And so that's what the text says. Marriage is for life. If one gets a divorce and then marries another, they are called an adulteress or an adulterer if it's the man by God. But if their mate dies, they are free to remarry. Now we've looked at remarry. Now we've looked at Romans chapter 7. I want us to understand here who can marry. Who are those that have a right to marry? Because Romans chapter 7 pointed out that that woman didn't have a right to marry. Well, who then can remarry? Or who then can marry? Let's understand this. Well, who then can remarry? Or who then can marry? Let's understand this. Those that can marry are, first and foremost, those who never have been married. In Matthew chapter 19 and verses 4 and 5, they leave father and mother and are joined to his wife. They've never been married. They're still the father and mother. For marriage is honorable among all, and the bad undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. In 1 Corinthians 7 verse 9, if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. These are those that have never been married. Verse 28, but even if you do not marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, have a right to be married. Those whose mate has died has a right to be married. Romans 7 verse 3. We already saw that in Romans chapter 7 and in verse 3. So then if, while her husband lived, she marries another man, she will be called an adulteress, but if her husband dies, she is so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man. So in this case, you have this couple over here, and he dies. She is free to remarry. She can remarry because her mate has died. There are those who put away their mate for fornication. There are those who put away their mate for fornication have a right to remarry. Matthew 19:9. And whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality or fornication, being the better term there, and marries another, commits adultery. In the case where they put away their mate, because they put away their mate has no right to remarry. We saw last week the one that was put away does not. The guilty party does not have a right to remarry, but the innocent party that put away their mate for the cause of fornication is free to remarry. And then there are those who are reconciling. 1 Corinthians 7, 10, and 11. Look at 1 Corinthians 7. Look at 1 Corinthians 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. Now to the married I command, yet not I but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her depart. Let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. Now in this case, they only have the right to be married to each other. But you have this couple over here that got a divorce, an unscriptural divorce. They divorced for a reason outside the cause of fornication. They have two options: remain unmarried, or, and the best option, would be reconciled to one another. And they have a right to be married, but only to each other. But they can marry each other again after they divorce. And so they do reconcile. in this case, where they had a divorce that was unscriptural. But they have a right to be married to each other. And those are the only groups that have a right to be married. The reason being, now in this case, they're bound to one another still because they got an unscriptural divorce and they have to be married to one another, but in who's not bound. The bond is important in understanding marriage and divorce because those that are bound do not have a right to marry. Those that are not bound do have a right to marry. Let's see this again. Romans chapter 7, that they're bound by law as long as he lives. They're bound to one another. And as long as that bond exists, they're not free to remarry. Now here's something important to understand. In the case where one gets married, both parties must have the right to marry. Must have the right to marry. Otherwise it is adultery. So, you may have a woman over here that's never been married. She's never been married. She's bound to nobody. She has a right to marry. But then you may have a man over here who is divorced for whatever. Got a divorce for irreconcilable differences. Maybe he's the guilty party in a divorce. Whatever the reason is, he's still bound to that other woman. Again, more about that later on. But he's bound to somebody else. He's not free to marry. This woman over here is free to marry, but this man is not. If they get married, both somebody that she did not have the right to be married to, and he is guilty of adultery as well as she is, in Matthew chapter 5, as well as Matthew 19, point that out. So both parties must have a right to marry. This is important. It doesn't matter if one party has the right. One party has the right. Both must have the right to be married. Both must not be bound in order for them to marry one another. Now, let's talk about what the confusion is. The reason we have to deal with Romans chapter 7 is because there is some confusion over Romans chapter 7, or particularly some confusion over Romans chapter 7, or particularly, more particularly, there's confusion over the marriage and the bond. And the confusion is that there are many that want to equate the marriage and the bond. They want to make them the same thing. So maybe you'll hear something like, if they're no longer the same thing. So maybe you'll hear something like, if they're no longer married, then no longer bound. Or they'll contrast marriage and divorce as, here's a divorce in the eyes of God and a divorce in the eyes of me. That'll be the term you hear. That's a divorce in the eyes of men, but not in the eyes of God. And so what it is if the marriage God doesn't approve, then they say it's not real, or it's not in the eyes, or it's in the eyes of man, not in the eyes of God. And what this ends up having is the marriage and the bond have to be the same. Because they'll argue that this was not really a divorce, it was a divorce in the eyes of man. So you have a couple that gets divorced that's a divorce in the eyes of man. That there's only a divorce in the eyes of God, they argue, when the bond is severed. We'll talk later on about the fact that a marriage is a marriage and a divorce is a divorce. We've already talked about some of that earlier on. Well, we'll talk more about that later on, that as we look more at Romans 7, that clearly a marriage is a marriage, whether approved or disapproved. There's scriptural and unscriptural, but there's not in the eyes of God and the eyes of man. There's scriptural and unscriptural marriage. And we'll see that as we move throughout Romans 7 in more detail. But this right here is the confusion over Romans 7 and marriage. There are many that equate the two. There's the marriage and that equate the two. There's the marriage and the bonds in it. The bonds in it and the marriage. That the two, they must be the same. And they're not. The truth is, point number 4, the truth is, they are different. Go back to Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7. And I want you to notice what it says in Romans chapter 7. The two are different again. Or do you not know, or verse 2 rather. Verse 2, for the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband lives, she marries another man. These two people here that we have depicted on the screen are married. It says married, you just can't see it. But now, they're bound by God's law. They're bound to one another, but they're bound to one another by God's law. God's law, one mate for life. They're bound by God's law. Look again at Romans chapter 7. For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. Matthew chapter 19. What therefore God hath joined together. They're bound by God's law. Together. They're bound by God's law. God's law states that marriage is for life. They're bound by that law to one another, but it's not the same thing as the marriage relationship. It is possible for one to not be married and still be bound, or be bound to somebody they're not married to, married to one person and bound to another. I was understanding here the difference in the marriage and the bond, and we'll talk about being married to one and bound to another. Verse 2 here, this woman will honor her husband as long as he lives. So we'll say this woman got married, and then she got an unscriptural divorce. She's still bound to the first husband. She's bound by law to him as long as he lives. But then down here, she marries another man. She marries another man. There's a distinction between marriage and the bond. Again, some say, well, that's not really a marriage. That would be there in verse 3. That's a marriage in the eyes of man. God said it was marriage because this is written by inspiration here in Romans chapter 3. He doesn't approve of it, but it's still referred to as marriage. And she's married to the second man. She's married to her second husband, but she's bound to her first husband because she didn't have a reason to get a divorce. That he's still alive, she's bound to him by law as long as he lives. She's still bound to this first man up here. Which brings us to our next point, that you can be married to one but bound to another. Look again at the text. For the woman who hath a husband is bound by law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, so then if, while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. Let's look at the chart here, or the illustration at the bottom of the man. Let's look at the chart here, or the illustration at the bottom of the chart. This woman here, that's depicted in the middle, she's bound to this man over here on your left-hand side. She's bound to this first man. They were married, and they got a divorce, and they had no reason. They got a divorce, and they had no reason to get a divorce. She's bound to him. How long? As long as he lives. Romans chapter 7 and in verse 2. So she's bound to this man over here. This is her first husband. She's bound to him. They had a right to be married. Maybe this is their first marriage. Maybe they had a scriptural divorce. Maybe they had a previous mate that died. Whatever the reason is, these two have a right to be married and therefore are bound to one another by God's law. What's that law? The permanence of marriage. They're bound as law to get a divorce. So she marries this man over here. She's married to this man. Look at verse 3. Now, while her husband liveth, she be married to another man. Well, remember verse 2, she's bound as long as he liveth. In verse 3, he's still alive. Therefore, she may be married to this man, but she still exists. That is why this marriage is adultery. Romans chapter 7 is, to my knowledge, the only passage that tells us why a subsequent marriage, in the case of a divorce, where one gets divorced unscripturally, that tells us why a subsequent marriage is adultery. Because there's still subsequent marriage is adultery. Because there's still a bond that exists. Because she's called an adulteress because she's bound to the first husband even though she's married to another. That's the reason it is adultery. So as you look at this passage, she is bound to this man even though she's married to somebody else. She's bound to this man as long as he lives, even though she's married to this other man over here. And this is important in understanding why it's wrong, because if the marriage and the bond are one and the same, she's either got to be married to this first husband, And the reason that she doesn't have a right to be married to her second husband is the bond and the marriage are. And the bond can exist separate and apart from one being married. They may have been married, had the right to be married, and now they're bound. Then they get a divorce for a reason other than fornication. They're still bound to one another. Neither one of them has the right to be married. Marriage and the bond are distinct and different. It's possible to be bound to one. Marriage and the bond are distinct and different. It's possible to be bound to one, but be married to another. It is possible, too, for one to be released from the bond, but the other not be. This answers the question. Some say, well, if the bond ends when one gets a divorce for fornication, then they should be free to for fornication. Then they should be free to. Both parties should be free to remarry. That's the thought. If they're bound to one another, then they should be free to remarry when that bond ends, when that marriage ends. If she puts him away for fornication, then they should both be free. But that's not the case. They should both be free. But that's not the case. It's possible for one to be bound to the other not bound. The thought is that the two is simply a binding together, but the binding is done by God's law to one another. It's not like tying a rope between two people. And that's the illustration sometimes used. You take a rope, you tie two people together. If one gets free, the other gets free. You can tie, when you take a yoke of oxen, you would put one on one side and one on the other. And it's possible to release one yoke of oxen and leave the other still there then. It's possible for one to remain and the other be free in that illustration. Well, that's a better depiction of how the marriage relationship is. We use the illustration here. We won't name them Jack and Jill. We're not tying Jack and Jill together with a rope. That's not what the bond is. The bond is more like this yoke here. And so he puts her away for fornication. He now has the right to remarry. He is no longer bound to her. Matthew 19:9. Whoever divorces his wife, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. If, though, he puts her away for sexual immorality, he can put her away and he has the right to remarry and it not be adultery. She cannot remarry because she is still bound to him, even though he's released from the bond. Because they're bound by God's law. Again, they're not tied together like with a rope. The bond is more like this. It would be more like how the yoke of oxen is depicted. One can be set free and the other not be. And so it's possible that if she's guilty of adultery, he puts her away. And he's free to not bound to her. And so, this is important in our understanding. This is why the innocent party that puts away their mate is free to remarry. But the guilty party that is put away does not have a right to remarry, because the guilty party is still bound while the innocent party is not. Now, thus the marriage is a marriage and the divorce is a divorce. We looked at this already and made the point about the terms that are used, the divorce in the eyes of God and the divorce in the eyes of man. But if you look at Romans chapter 7, and you look at other passages, a divorce is a divorce and a marriage is a marriage, approved or disapproved. For example, marriage is a marriage, approved or disapproved. For example, God approves, and we'll call this a scriptural marriage. The term used is marriage. Let marriage, Hebrews 13:4, let marriage be held in honor among all and the bed undefiled. Matthew 19:9, whoever divorces his wife and marries another. Matthew 19:9, whoever divorces his wife and marries another is called a marriage when he puts her away for fornication and marries another. 1 Corinthians 7:9 as well as 28, they can be married. The virgin is free to marry. Verse 28. In verse 9, let them be married if they cannot exercise self-control. They have a right to be married. 1 Corinthians 7. If they didn't have a right, Paul wouldn't have told them they could get married. They have a right to be married, and so they're told they can get married. That's a scriptural marriage that God approves of. At the same time, it would be unscriptural. And now God still refers to it as a marriage. Mark chapter 6. I think Mark 6, well, a couple other passages, Matthew 19, 1 and 7, but I think Mark 6 is the best passage at depicting this in all of the scriptures. Look at Mark chapter 6, verse 17. For Herod himself has sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. And so Herodias was married to Philip. They're divorced now, but she's still bound to Philip. They didn't have a right to get a divorce. She's still bound to him by God's law. Romans, she's married to Herod. Look again, verse 17. Herod had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he, that is Herod, hadn't married. So, Herod and Herodias are married. But John rebukes them because Herodias doesn't have the right to be married. She's still bound to Philip. So she doesn't have a right to be married. She's bound to Philip. But they got married, divorced. She divorced Philip and married Herod anyway. In the Scriptures, by inspiration, that's called a marriage in Mark chapter 6. Inspiration, that's called a marriage in Mark chapter 6. God does not approve of it, but it's still a marriage. In Matthew chapter 19, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another. It's the same word approved of God because there was a scriptural divorce, or it's disapproved because there was an unscriptural divorce. It's still referred to as marriage in both instances. Thus, a marriage is a marriage. Again, some try to equate the marriage and the bond and have them be the same thing and say that a marriage in the eyes of man versus a marriage in the eyes of God. A marriage in the eyes of man versus a marriage in the eyes of God. Here's what we need to understand. The marriage God does not approve of, He still says is a marriage. The bond is what we need to understand. Because they're bound to somebody else. They don't have a right to be married. But God still says it's a marriage, approved or they don't have a right to be married. But God still says it's a marriage, approved or not. Thus a marriage is a marriage. And a divorce is a divorce. When God approves in Matthew 19 of the putting away, whoever puts away his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another commits adultery. So let's look over here on the left-hand side. Whoever puts away or divorces his wife for any cause other than fornication is committing sin. Whoever divorces his wife for the cause of fornication is not committing sin. But it's the same word on your translation. It's the same word whether it's approved by God or disapproved by God. There is no Matthew 19:9 where it says, and whoever puts away his wife, but only in the eyes of men, but not really in the eyes of God, because God doesn't approve of it, but it is in the eyes of man, is guilty of adultery. But whoever puts away his right? He doesn't say in Matthew chapter 19 that whoever divorces his wife only in the eyes of men is sinning, and whoever divorces his wife in the eyes of God is not. He calls it a divorce in both instances. Same word, rendered put away or divorce. In fact, that word only occurs there. And there's an exception phrase there in the middle of it. So a divorce is a divorce, approved or not. A marriage is a marriage, approved by God or not. There is no marriage in the eyes of man versus marriage in the eyes of God. God recognizes they may be married, but He doesn't institute a bond between them because they don't have a right. He says that marriage is sinful. Now, let's talk about what this means. Well, there was another slide here. Let's talk about, when we're talking about what the truth is, and it's not going to be on the slide before you, God does the loosening. For just a second. Romans chapter 7. They're bound by the law as long as they live. Matthew 19, whatever God hath joined together, let not man separate. And so, the truth is that only God can do the loosening. The loosening. Now, that loosening is done in one of two ways. Hopefully, the reason the loosening eventually happens is because they've been married until the death of one of those two mates. That is the only way that God will loose the bond between them in which somebody is not guilty of sin. Resulting in the death, or when one of the mates dies, then the bond is loosed. They are no longer bound because that mate no longer lives. But again, as we've already stated, that bond is loosed in terms of for one of the parties when they put away their mate for fornication. Go back to our illustration earlier. We had Jack and Jill. Jill was guilty of divorce. Jack put her away. He's free to remarry. She's not. But God loosed the bond on Jack to where he's free to remarry. Those are the only two ways the bond is loosed. Is either by one of the parties and then the mate puts them away and the innocent mate is free to remarry. Or in the case where one of the mates dies, then they are free too. Then the mate still living is free to remarry because there no longer is a bond that exists. But that bond is loosed by God, not by man. Man can't do anything to loose the bond. By God, not by man. Man can't do anything to loose the bond. In fact, just as a side note, the bond is not loose. Some argue the bond is loosed at the point of the sin of fornication. That's not true either. Because the innocent parties can remain with the guilty party and forgive them of their sin. No party forgave the guilty party and they work things out. They're still bound to one another. That happens when the divorce takes place. Then God will loose that bond when the innocent party puts away the guilty party for the cause of fornication. Now let's talk about what this means. What this means is we take everything that we've seen here for life, about being bound for life. What the text says about her being called an adulteress if she's married to somebody else. We talk about those who can marry, what the confusion is. We talk about how some equate the marriage to the bond. We talk about the truth. The bond and the marriage are two distinct, different things. One to be married to one and bound to somebody else. It's possible for one to be bound and the other not be. And we talked about how it is that bond is loosened and the fact that a divorce is a divorce, approved or not, and a marriage is a marriage, approved or not. Let's talk about what this means. This means, number one can be bound and scripturally married. There are four things that this really means when it comes to marriage and bond. Number one is that there are those that are bound to one another and are scripturally married. Two people that are never married, they are scripturally married. Two people that are never married, they marry one another. Now they're joined together in the marriage relationship. They're bound by God. They're bound by God's law. How long? As long as they live. Per Romans chapter 7 and verse 2. They have a right to be married and they are bound. Chapter 7, Matthew 19, 5-6, God joined them together. So when you have two people that are scripturally married and they're bound to one another. By the way, the only way the marriage is scriptural requires them being bound to one another. They have to be bound in order for the marriage to be a scriptural relationship. Scripturally married. It's also possible for one to be bound and unmarried. 1 Corinthians 7, 10, and 11. 1 Corinthians 7, 10, and 11, you have this couple gets a divorce for a reason they shouldn't have. They're still bound to one another. Because remember, the marriage and the bond are two distinct, different things. But because they got a divorce. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 10 and 11. Now to the husband I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. She's unmarried when she departs. And they get a divorce, she's unmarried. The thing is, she's still bound to her husband. She's unmarried when she departs. And they get a divorce, she's unmarried. The thing is, she's still bound because she didn't have a right to get a divorce. And she's still bound by law. It is possible that one mate can be bound and unmarried while the other man is free to remarry. So again, go back to our illustration with our make the way Jill for fornication. She's bound to him still, but he's not bound. They're no longer married because he put her away. They got a divorce. He divorced her for the cause of fornication. She's still bound to him though, but he's free from the bond and free to remarry because he put her away. The other mate can be unbound and free to remarry. In the case where one puts away their mate for fornication. Finally, one can be bound to one person while unscripturally married to another. Romans chapter 7. Have a woman who, she got divorced from her first husband for whatever reason, but there was no legitimate cause for him, and she's the guilty party. And she's still bound one way or the other. She's still bound to the first husband. And she marries another man. She's still bound to that first man. Even though she's married to somebody else. You can have the case where a person is bound to one person. Where you have someone bound to one person is bound to one person. Where you have someone bound to one person while unscripturally married to another person. So she's still bound to the first husband. In our illustration we used earlier, this woman's still bound to her first husband that she didn't have a right to get divorced from. But she's married to another man. And in that case, she is guilty of sin. Excuse me, she's guilty of sin. And is called an adulteress by God. Romans chapter 7, 2 and 3, as well as Mark 16, where Herodias is married to Herod, but she's bound. That's why John rebuked her. And hopefully, what we've seen this morning will help you in understanding the marriage and the bond, and help you in answering a lot of questions about the marriage and the bond and divorce in general. Because if we understand the marriage and the bond are distinct, they're different. They're not the same thing. We understand the permanence of that bond. And we understand that only those who are not bound have a right to be married. Then, we can answer a lot of questions about divorce or marriage. So somebody comes to you and says, I've got this situation. This person over here, they got a divorce for whatever reason. Are they free to remarry? Well, let's take a look at it. Was the cause for fornication? No. Okay? And if they didn't get a divorce for fornication, their mate's still alive. Let's look at it here. Are they bound? They're bound to the first mate. Right? They're bound to the first mate. As long as he lives. So there's a bond that exists. There's a bond that exists. They're not free to remarry. And so that helps us in answering a lot of questions about who can and can't. Bond that exists. They're not free to remarry. And so that helps us in answering a lot of questions about who can and cannot marry. And because as long as there's a bond that exists, then one cannot marry. So hopefully that helps us in understanding the marriage and the bond. Again, as we come to a close, I want to remind you that if you have any questions on divorce or marriage you want to ask, and put it in that basket back there by the end of tonight, and I'll collect those this evening, and then I'll seek to answer those questions that you have next week. But hopefully we've answered a lot of questions you may have this morning as well as last week. As we come to a close this morning, we're just singing the All Right with God. And at the time we sing that is the time for one that needs to respond in obedience to the gospel. You see, you're not guaranteed another day, for what is life but a vapor that appears for a short time and then vanisheth away. And so if you're here and you've never obeyed the gospel, now is the time to do so. If you've heard the word of God and you believe that Jesus is buried in the waters of baptism, you'll rise out of those waters to walk in a newness of life, a new creature. And you'll have your home in heaven if you serve God faithfully unto the end. Or maybe you're here and you've done that and you say, somewhere along the line, I've not lived as I should. If it's sin of a private nature, take it to the Lord privately in prayer. But if of a public nature, we will pray with you and for you for God to forgive you. But if we can assist you